And we need to stop just renouncing being a part of the system and a part of the process. We need to stop screaming for some ill-defined or completely undefined revolution that nobody's making any efforts towards seeing through. And we need to stop thinking that our hashtags are going to change the world.
Back in 2022, I did an interview with Lucien Greaves, the founder and spokesperson of the Satanic Temple, a non-theistic Satanist organization based in the United States, but with branches all over the world. Now, I really recommend that you watch that interview because we really explain what the Satanic Temple is. But as a kind of a Cliff Notes version of it, when we say that it is a non-theistic satanic organization, what that means is that they don't actually believe in the devil. They don't believe in God, for that matter, or in Satan, Moloch, or any other demon or devil. They use these things as symbols, for the same reason that metal fans, for example, use the sign of the horns, not because they actually believe in the devil, or, if you are to believe Ronnie James Dio's origin story for it, in the Malocchio, the evil eye that you're trying to protect yourself from with the horns, but rather kind of as a cultural symbol, even if you don't believe in the magical parts associated with it. Again, if you want to understand what the Satanic Temple does, please check that video. But what we're going to talk about today is not really so much about the Satanic Temple and its philosophy, but instead about some of the developments that have been happening both in the United States as well as abroad. In the case of the United States, we discuss the attempts of some legislatures to start bringing more religious symbols into public spaces. In particular, there is, for example, a law in Louisiana that mandates the presence of the 10 Commandments in all publicly funded schools and universities. So there has to be a poster in the cafeteria, in the classrooms, etc., from kindergarten all the way to universities. So for people who want to ensure that there is a separation of church and state, that is a gigantic problem, and that is one of the topics that we discuss with Julian. Also, there is a situation happening in Europe that has to do with the increasing popularity of some people might call them right-wing, or they might call them populist parties, and their position when it comes to issues of freedom of religion. We discuss, for example, the proposals to ban the use of the hijab, which is the Muslim headscarf, the one that only covers the hair. It is not the burqa, which covers the entire face, or the niqab, which leaves the eyes out. It's just the headscarf, as well as the possibility that sometimes left-wing activism has actually given a lot of support or push to religion, as well as to backwards reactionary philosophies, because people see the craziness of one side and they respond necessarily with the extreme from the other. I think that this is a very interesting conversation, and I am sure that you're going to enjoy it. Remember that if you want to support us, you can always go to our Substack and sign up. In the case of this interview, for example, if you sign up to the Substack, you're going to have access to the transcript of the interview. But I don't like the idea of taking somebody's time and then, not paying those people, but then trying to profit from those people. So the interview itself, the entire interview, is always going to be for free, available on YouTube as well as on Rumble in case this thing ever gets taken down. But the transcript, as well as links and more information about this interview, about what is happening in the United States, about secularism, etc., will be available on Substack for those who want to sign up and support us. If you go to metalblast.net, same thing. It'll basically take you to our Substack. So either way, it should work out. It is always a pleasure to have conversations like the ones that I had with Lucien, and I really think that you're going to enjoy it. Until I see you again, non serviam, stay metal, and take care of yourselves. Before we begin with our actual conversation, or rather the reason why we're meeting today, I wanted to know, how are you doing and how is the temple? Because the last time we spoke, someone had just tried to burn down the temple in Salem.
A suspected arsonist caught on video lighting fire to a satanic temple in Salem. In fact, the guy was still at the scene when police arrived to arrest him. And beyond that, the 42-year-old Chelsea man admitted that he traveled to Salem specifically to set the fire.
And investigators say in this case there is just so much evidence. The video, for example, cameras up there, that allegedly showed him walking up these steps on Friday, pouring lighter fluid on the porch, and then setting it ablaze. The fact that police say he told them that members of this temple needed to be, quote, wiped out. On Monday, 42-year-old Daniel Lucy answered to the crime in court. Police say the temple's doorbell camera showed him approaching the porch in a God t-shirt, dousing it with an accelerant and setting it ablaze.
And then stood across the street to watch the flames.
A citizen journalist captured his arrest. Investigators say Lucy confessed. He even stated to officers, quote, "This is a hate crime."
That he had followed a GPS on his phone to the temple in Salem. The people were devil worshippers, and he would not lose any sleep over people in the building being hurt.
And this year, somebody threw a pipe bomb. A dude that thankfully has been captured. I think he pleaded not guilty, but at least he has been identified.
Surveillance video, but also a single strand of hair helped authorities track down the suspect all the way in Oklahoma. Now, according to federal documents, they say 49-year-old Sean Palmer bought the pipe at a hardware store in Oklahoma and then taped metal nails to it. The pipe was also filled with a powder-like substance preliminarily identified as smokeless gunpowder. Now, the pipe bomb partially detonated, causing minor damage to the Satanic Temple's exterior. Leaders here are relieved that Palmer was caught.
How are you? Because I can imagine that it is... I think that a lot of people see the temple as kind of a trolling organization without thinking that, regardless of anything else, there are many people who take it seriously enough to want you dead.
Well, that's just a reality I've had to internalize, and even, just getting the canine dog, that's something that I probably wouldn't have gone through that kind of seismic lifestyle shift if this weren't the case. But I mean, at least fortunately for me, I always somewhat anticipated this kind of thing. It was never a joke to me. I felt that democracy was under threat and that we had a real theocratic movement trying to really execute a coup in the United States, and they're making great gains toward that end. So even in 2013, when we started, I didn't take this lightly. Most people did, I think, because it was during the Obama administration, and I think they just really lacked the foresight to see the direction things were going in, and they didn't realize that all we needed was another presidential candidate who was going to be, we're trying to placate the demands of the evangelical nationalists in the United States to go the direction that we're going. And if it wasn't going to be Trump, it was going to be somebody else. And, that trajectory has been, I think, predictable for some time. This has been an intergenerational initiative to try to bring the United States under theocratic rule. And that was something we were responding to then. And it's something that we anticipated getting worse. And the threat level has gone up, but in certain ways we feel vindicated as well. But you do wonder how some of these things change you as a person overall, how, especially with me, if I look more than 10 years ago before starting the Satanic Temple, as generally an anonymous guy who didn't mind being an anonymous guy and didn't have a real desire to be in the public spotlight, up into this position now, having a certain type of micro celebrity about me and this absolute notoriety where I have almost an equal amount of people who want me dead, is something that changes the way you interact with people generally. And that's something I have to think about to make sure that I'm still being rational in the decisions I make. But things are really reaching a real fever pitch right now, especially with the election coming up. And it's difficult to know who to trust and how.
The issue that you bring up, this of the rising kind of Christian nationalism, I would call it Christian fascism, that is happening in the United States. I think that indeed it has coincided, of course, with the rise of Trump. But I think that the push that has come into the evangelical Christian side of things is kind of invisible for the people who are outside of the US, because it tends to happen in local state legislatures, for example. So what kind of advances has this kind of far-right evangelical wing, what sort of advances have they been doing in the US lately?
Well, it's still more of the same, but it is making more headway. Now they know they have a Supreme Court on their side, and they're aggressively pushing for agendas they've been pushing for a long time. And even though you see these things popping up at the local level, where all of a sudden you'll see a state superintendent in Oklahoma saying that he's going to put the Bible in all the schools, and they're displaying the 10 Commandments in all the schools. These aren't typically the local uprisings. They're not really grassroots movements, even though they're presented as such. There's model legislation that's being put together by organizations, centralized organizations within the United States that also focus on trying to advance theocracy abroad. But they will turn in these templates for legislation to all these different localities, and then try everywhere they can to advance these theocratic efforts. Like I said, putting 10 Commandments in the schools and things like that over and over again, just to see what gains they make. And in a lot of ways, the left-wing activist side of it really actually helps us along, because they've internalized some of the worst practices for activism, organization, and resistance, to the point where they seem to really just be at a point of acceptance, and at a point where they actually seem to prefer identifying as the underdog, even though numbers are on our side. You know, most people are opposed to these theocratic efforts, but aside from the Christian nationalists who really kind of organize, try to get into the government, try to push these agendas, build model legislation, they're counterpoint. They're the people who are supposedly their opposition. They're just best at complaining about that and identifying as the people who complain about that. And in many cases, just fundraising off of the idea that the theocrats are making advances, and sometimes without even listing a counter agenda at all. Just, if you stand up for your rights or whatever, send us money, which is what you'll see from the Women's March on a daily basis with their emails. Organizations like that are just, propaganda money generating mills who don't really seem to take seriously the very real threat to our liberties. And when you see, like I said, a state superintendent in Oklahoma said, we're going to put the Bible in every classroom, I feel like he was kind of saying that at the time that he did to distract everybody from the fact that the Oklahoma Supreme Court had just ruled that it was illegal, the bill that the governor had most recently passed in Oklahoma, to give public funds to religious schools. So that was a bill they had passed into law and that they were moving on. And then the Supreme Court of Oklahoma deliberated on it and said, no, this is clearly illegal. We do not allow public funds to fund religious schools. And so that one's off the books. Problem is that everybody knew that they passed the law, and there was very little talk about how the law was overturned. So I think what you're seeing is a situation in the United States where everybody has taken for granted that these things can and do happen, and that the theocrats have some kind of constitutional argument for what they're doing, that they pass these laws and they'll stay in place, and that we've already lost these rights, that we haven't. And at this point, the Oklahoma Supreme Court said, no, this is illegal, this isn't allowed. But what happens is you get judges in who have an agenda, you have judges who are part of the Christian nationalist movement, And they see that people have already accepted these rights being taken away. So they feel more emboldened as time goes on to take a bad law and accept its justifications and allow it to remain. And I think in this way, the left-wing activists of the United States are allowing this coup to happen. They refuse to acknowledge progress when it's made. They refuse to acknowledge the rights that we have on paper. They refuse to acknowledge that we are a secular, pluralistic nation, and that because they favor decrying the United States and its history over emphasizing what we've done right and what we can continue to do right, and what we should try to maintain, what we should try to uphold, and what we should protect. To a certain degree, it feels like they have already given up. And that's just a world of opportunity for the people who are working against us now. And it's to a point where I kind of feel like it's the Satanic Temple alone. And of course, there's other groups we do work in collaboration with, but the overall culture of the left, who we feel where we would find our most steadfast allies from, I think have internalized some of the worst practices of activism, and that's coming home to roost now.
The first question I think that some people might have is, it is true the United States has in its First Amendment and the Establishment Clause this separation between church and state, or at least the fact that the state should not be playing favorites in the battle of faith. But let's assume for a second that that isn't an argument, that the argument is not this violates the First Amendment. What do you care that the Bible appears in a school or that the Ten Commandments appear in a school? What is the bad thing about that?
The thing is what do they care that the Ten Commandments should be in the schools plastered on the walls, or that the Bible should be in the schools? My problem with it is that it appears like it's an official endorsement of a specific viewpoint. And I think that's the message conveyed to the children. And when you read the reasoning that they passed some of these laws to try to put the Ten Commandments in schools, or the rationale behind putting the Bibles into school, it's based on a completely false revisionist history in which Moses was an American, and the Ten Commandments were used to establish constitutional law. It's very clear that the Ten Commandments, if they had any type of influence on constitutional law, it was a negative one. You have "Thou shalt have no gods before me," which seems like a prohibition against any other religion, clearly, and a very anti-pluralistic point of view. You have prohibitions against free speech when you say name in vain, that type of thing. Most of the commandments have to do with only having the one God, and that God being Jehovah. The fact is, though, that I don't really think they care about the children seeing this, and I don't think that their arguments for giving the children a sense of heritage and history and a moral foundation are actually what they're looking to do at all. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to rewrite history through legislation. They write into the legislation, like I said, these rationales that say, because the constitutional law was based on the Ten Commandments, we feel that this is educational for the children. They may know that the Ten Commandments were not influential on constitutional law. It doesn't matter. At that point, they've rewritten history, and they feel like they've proven that without expert witnesses or without any reference to history, merely by codifying it into law. And I think that's more important for them, because it seems to me that ever since "In God We Trust" went on our currency, they've used that as kind of a license for exclusive privilege for Christianity. They've held that up. They'll hold up a dollar bill and say, it says "In God We Trust," and therefore, we have special rights over other people. And I feel like that's really what these efforts come down to when they're trying to put Ten Commandments on the walls. They don't necessarily care about that, but they're always using these things as a stepping stone towards the next thing. They'll say, this is why we have "In God We Trust" on money. This is why we put the Ten Commandments in schools. And now this is why we're passing anti-blasphemy laws, or now this is why, we're doing any other egregious violation of your rights because it does not fall in line with these moral tenets that we've already established in our minds, and through codifying it, through the back door, through this legislative rationales, that we are now a Christian nation and this should be the law of the land.
Now, it is interesting, of course, that you mentioned the issue of "In God We Trust," because that is added to the man in the United States, I think in the 50s or 60s, so kind of in the Red Scare. It is not so much to show Christianity, but rather we are not a godless atheist government like the Soviet Union, right? So indeed, it is trying to show what type of country the United States aims to be.
It's during Eisenhower's presidency, for instance, that the prayer breakfast became an annual event, an event at which clerics and politicians of all political stripes come together to pray for the nation.
We get the addition of "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance for the first time. It had previously been secular. It had no mention of God. We get the adoption of "In God We Trust" as the nation's first official motto in 1956. It's added to paper currency for the first time in 1957.
President Eisenhower and Postmaster Summerfield take part in the introduction of the first stamp with a religious message. The new stamp will carry to the world America's message of liberty and faith.
Now, if the debate that we're having had to do with not debate, I'm sorry, because I think that you and I agree on the vast majority of things anyway, but the conversation that we're having was about the problem of establishing Sharia law the way Saudi Arabia applies it, or the way Pakistan applies it, or Afghanistan applies it, I think that it would be very easy for people to say, all right, I mean, there is a clear violation of freedom of speech, there is a very clear violation of women's rights, etc. So other than the historical revisionism that comes as a result of trying to show the United States as a Christian nation, what would be the bad thing of actually going along with that mythology? Like, let's say that, for the sake of argument, in the same way that we lie to kids about how Santa Claus exists, we just assume as a founding myth of the United States that the United States is a Christian nation and that Christianity is kind of special, or Judeo-Christianity is kind of special within the American system. Why would that be a bad thing?
Well, when you get into these debates with a theist, they usually like to broaden the argument to the extent that they'll say things like, well, you say the universe started with the Big Bang, but science can't answer what happened before the Big Bang, therefore God. And that's one thing, but it's another thing to say, therefore God, and therefore this book is correct, and therefore we know God hates homosexuals and advocates for the subjugation of women, and all the types of things that go with that agenda of pushing the notion that we need to have no gods before him, and that's the fear. It's not just that people should respect that Christians have this mythology, or that Abrahamic religions have this mythology overall, this monotheistic take on a creator of the universe who provides this moral framework by which we all work. It's the imposition of that moral framework that at this point, I think non-theists in general find backward and a bit barbaric and well outdated. And it like I said, it doesn't stop with just we're trying to say this is our history and heritage, and you may disagree with history, but who cares? Well, they've already overturned Roe versus Wade, which was the precedent in the United States that allowed abortions to be federally legal, in efforts to make it illegal in as many places as they could, give the states the rights to ban it outright. In some states there's all kinds of legal battles being fought throughout the United States, and there's more coming up. They don't really care. You're talking about ideologues with a dogmatic point of view and an agenda, and they really don't care if there's destruction on the level of civil war when they're aiming for a type of utopia. And they have, and I think we've seen certain levels of delusion in some of our public representative sets very troubling. I think even in private conversations, some of them probably truly believe that leading us towards Armageddon would be a good thing, that the second coming of Christ is imminent, and that they need to prepare for this return, and that they are fully willing to roll back every gain in the rights revolution to, again, subjugate women, illegalize gay marriage or even gay activity of any type, and to just really take us back to the Bronze Age.
I think that once again, I believe that many people outside of the United States just fail to imagine, or even people who just don't interact with people who don't think like them, they fail to understand just how extreme some kind of mainstream evangelical ideas are. I mean, in the United States Congress, you have this character, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who...
Let's watch some crazy stuff, yo!
I worship God. God. And Jesus is my savior.
I don't believe in evolution. I don't believe in that type of so-called science. I don't believe in evolution. I believe in God.
This wall says, in God we trust. And if that is the case, then this Congress will reject this evil bill and protect the innocent unborn. If this nation becomes a nation where we have such a federal law that can kill a baby up until the day of birth, then God will no longer provide protection in his grace over America.
People believe that Q is someone very close to President Trump. According to him, many in our government are actively worshiping Satan, or they call Moloch. I mean, is it going to be true that the child pedophilia in the elites in the Washington, D.C., is that what we're really going to see come out? Is it going to be satanic worship?
Who could it be? Who could it be? I just can't imagine who. Could it be Satan?
You would be laughed out of a room if you were speaking in a college or something like that. And yet this is a United States representative talking about how evolution doesn't exist, it's not a real thing, and how she, kneels before God and a bunch of, nonsense, for lack of a better word. And we are seeing now something that, I want to connect with what you were saying before about these left-wing activists, because I don't know if you're familiar with a woman named Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Yes.
Well, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for those who are not familiar with her, she was a Somali refugee here in the Netherlands. She was a member of parliament, and she eventually moved to the United States. One of the things that
An ex-Muslim.
Correct. What made her very famous was the fact that she was that she apostatized from Islam, and that she became a very outspoken atheist. She faced enormous threats to her life, and eventually moved to the United States behind a political controversy that happened here in the Netherlands. What is interesting is that recently she converted to Christianity, and she did so quite publicly. And in a recent conversation she had with Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion, she mentions how, I think it is a bit of a kind of Machiavellian conversion, in the sense that she basically talks about why Christianity is convenient. And I want to connect that with the issue of the left-wing activism, because what she says is, atheism and everything that is connected with atheism, and even science, etc., has failed to provide answers, or at least meaningful answers. It doesn't give me, or it didn't give me, she says, kind of a reason for living, something that religion does do. It does give you a justification for existence. Now, without agreeing with that section of what she said, I do believe that sometimes people see the nonsense or the apparent insanity sometimes of left-wing activism, and they feel so repulsed by it that kind of they respond by thinking, well, then Christianity must be correct. In the case of Europe, we see it a lot with Islam as well, that people suddenly start to find conservative ideologies either in conservative Christianity or in conservative Islam. Do you think that part of the reason why Christianity or Christian nationalism is having this increased presence in the United States is precisely connected with the fact that a lot of the leftist promises fail to give people kind of a meaningful existence?
I think, I think there's a lot to that.
There's a long, it was a really long-winded question. I'm sorry.
But there's a lot there that's worth discussing and worth exploring, because I've seen this happen, and people are very social animals, and they need their network, they need their people, they need their tribe. And I think the left has done a very good job of beating people out of their tribe and engaging in an internal war of attrition where they can't accept somebody who's only 99% on their side in a lot of cases. And I've seen them take somebody who's only 99% on their side and may have some disagreement or be unsure on one topic or something. And I've seen them get beaten to the point where I think it's made them different people. It's turned them to a different tribe, and they begin to assimilate themselves to a whole different set of beliefs. And it may seem simple-minded, but it's also, I think, sometimes just self-preservation. I don't think some people really have the emotional fortitude to go through that ostracization, of being a pariah, and then finding that there seems to be no way to return. And I feel like that's one of the worst things the left has done in the course of all of this, is leave so little flexibility for some people to reform themselves of bad points of views, to be corrected, rather than just denigrated, defamed, and just beaten away from the cause or from a certain point of view. And I think there's a lot of people who have gamed the dogmatism of some of the left without really a strong adherence to any real viewpoint at all, but advancing themselves in a rather narcissistic fashion. And they've kind of helped spur this along. I mean, in the United States and elsewhere, they've called this cancel culture. And I think, that is usually a narrow focus on what happens online when people dogpile somebody, but it happens in a lot of different ways too. I don't generally like the terminology, because a lot of these culture war catchphrases carry baggage that people make assumptions you're talking about something maybe you're not. But I've seen that dynamic play out, and I think it's been one of the most harmful things to us. And I think the natural response, the intuitive response to the extreme polarization of one end, is to further polarize on the other and match extremism for extremism. And I've come to the conclusion now that that's absolutely wrong, that shouldn't be the way we do it. More than anything, we should be trying to engage in discussion with people with the assumption that they are looking at different facts. Maybe they're looking at the facts wrongly, maybe they're misinformed, but maybe they actually hold their viewpoints because they think they're true. And until we know otherwise, we should assume that, and we should speak to them with a mind of getting to why they believe what they believe, and maybe then discuss how they can think about it differently to get them to frame these things differently, think about things differently. And maybe they'll come to different conclusions, but maybe we will too. But that interplay is important, and I don't feel like any of us get anywhere if we don't engage in that kind of dialogue, if we don't leave some room to accept that we might be wrong about some certain things and that somebody else might be right and have something to teach us. Otherwise, we're no better than the dogmatic Christian nationalists who have shut their minds off to anything that conflicts with their biblical interpretation of the world.
Now, I agree with the point that you're making, but when a local legislature, for example, wants to put Christmas, decorations or, a nativity scene in their spaces, and the temple says, okay, then we're going to put a Baphomet there as well. I like the Baphomet stuff, obviously, but don't you think that that is exactly what you're saying that you dislike, in the sense that you are coming to them? I mean, you're not going to be standing next to the Baphomet having a discussion with everybody who dislikes it. There's people are just going to see it and think, this person is basically giving me the finger, or this organization is giving us the finger. So do you think that that sort of actions have actually been counterproductive to the goals that your organization has?
I think it's incumbent upon us to explain these things, and we do what we can. And I think we're not, we never came into this thinking like, okay, we've got 10, 15 years or whatever, and then we pull the plug on this. I mean, 10 years is a little long to assume we would have done that anyways, but we're looking towards being a long-term presence in human society hereafter. And I feel like the only way for us to do that is to continually engage, regardless of how people feel about it immediately on the surface. And I think as generations pass, we become just another religious viewpoint. But I feel more importantly than that, even if what we were doing is coming in and just raising the middle finger and saying, we don't like the Christian display here and we want to offend you because it's here, I think people would be misinterpreting what we're doing. People do that, but I think it's more important then that they realize that the principle of free speech and pluralism is more important than their reservations about a satanic display. If you really believe in free speech and pluralism, you will not, it's not up to you to interrogate whether you agree with people's lifestyles, so long as what they're doing are within the boundaries of the law, whether you like the iconography, even whether or not you find it insulting. But knowing that there is a real reason and a benefit to not allowing the government to make those kinds of determinations. So I think if people are going to be offended on the face of it and think that we're doing something we're not, that's one thing. But they really should realize what values are supported here, in that we're not taking advantage of them. What we're doing is inherent to that very system. And if we could just actually get better at, not allowing ourselves to be so easily intimidated and provoked, which I think is an extreme problem right now. That's why trolling is so effective anymore. I think we'd all be quite a bit better off. So to a certain degree, I don't mind that people have that reaction to us, because I hope it can lead to that epiphany overall, where even if they don't like us, they'll realize it's better off to have us there and suffer that indignity if they view it as such, than to have a government coming in and being able to make those determinations and say that you're not allowed to believe this, you're not allowed to, because to be clear, even though I say we're not doing that's, we're not coming in trying to make a mockery of other people's beliefs and holding up the middle finger, I would defend another party's right to do exactly that.
But I think that also my question, because I think is the way in which the question is usually posed in the media, or which is like, is this a religion or is this just offensive? Kind of starts from the assumption that Christians have a right to be offended and that others don't have the right to be offended at Christianity and their nonsense. I find Christianity offensive, just like Islam and Judaism and any other theistic religion. So I think that it is very important to be very clear on the fact that you are offended by something, if you want to give yourself the right to destroy a religious altar or to attack people because of the offense that they cause on you, you have to be prepared to accept that they're going to come after you as well.
Right, but we haven't been the one destroying the displays. It's happened to ours. Yeah.
What I mean is that if the Christians say, well, this is so offensive that I am going to destroy it, then they have to be prepared to the fact that a lot of people might be offended by what Christianity actually represents. Now, before you said that it is important to meet people, or at least understand that people are not holding beliefs kind of as a way to troll the world, but rather that they actually do believe in them. I think that often when people encounter people who are religious, they don't assume that they believe it. They think that it's a bit of a joke. And here in Europe, we are experiencing something like that. In the last series of elections, there have been a number of right-wing parties that have won. And one of the, without mentioning any of the other issues that they refer to, one of the topics that continues to come up is the issue of the hijab, for example, which is just the scarf covering the hair of a woman. It is not the burqa, which covers the entirety, or the niqab, which leaves only the eyes out. It is just the hair. And in many of these parties want a ban of the hijab in public spaces. So in France, the party of Marine Le Pen wants to do that. Here in the Netherlands, the PVV, which is the current majority party, has also suggested that they would like, as far as I remember, banning of the hijab in public spaces. And I think that some of the people who support secularism have, well, before I say what I think about this, what do you feel about that type of measures?
You know, I can see a real argument for that going too far, because I mean, I know, at least here in the United States, people wear the hijab now as a statement of female liberation, regardless of how you feel as to whether that's misguided or not. In any case, they're not wearing it because they're subjugated and made to do it. So, you know, it really butts up against my sense of people's personal liberty to say that you can't wear something of your own free will, even if it's something that is traditionally symbolic of somebody else's subjugation. So I really don't know why governments feel a real need to get involved in that issue. I would feel like, I don't think a whole lot of that has happened in the United States. I think there were some areas that did try to pass hijab bans on the reasoning that it was essentially wearing a disguise in public. This would have been pre-COVID, you know, and the idea of even wearing a mask into a bank or something like that. And I don't think you can do that now, would have been disallowed. And I don't know how credible some of these arguments are, if they were really thought through and they were really, if they were really good faith arguments, but I could absolutely see that just being kind of like a culture war thing to do. This is something that's going to energize a certain base, and, you know, there's going to be a certain crowd that's going to vote for the person who they feel is now saying what everybody else is thinking, but doesn't have the guts to do or whatever. But that's the thing, you know, you get that same crowd, they'll often be crying about how the government overreaches on everything else. But then when it comes to an article of clothing, you know, they're all for the government being able to encroach and say that you're not allowed to do this, or, you know, a man isn't allowed to wear women's clothing. I mean, that's just bizarre, right? Like, why should we care if somebody else is doing those things?
What I often notice is that there are people who have kind of a good faith concern on the issue of women's rights, so that they see this demand for modesty for Muslim women. They do see that as a human rights issue. However, in the debate of banning the hijab, I think that generally it is people who objectively would prefer if those people weren't here with or without a hijab.
And if the concern really is domestic violence, the safety of women, I think there's a more direct way to approach the core issue than to look at something like a hijab, where I think there's too much gray area. Like I said, people wear it as a political statement now. I think the pro-Palestine protesters in the United States, and probably abroad too, have been wearing the hijabs when they have no pressure to do so, but it's become a matter of identity.
And I think that it's important to remember that, again, people do believe in their nonsense faiths, right? So that they do believe that they have to be modest, and one of the ways in which they show modesty is by covering not just their breasts and their butts, but also their hair. That used to be done. It is still done in some forms of Judaism. Oh my goodness, Judaism, and it used to be done also in Christianity. My concern is mostly the fact that I don't believe that the government should be in the business of telling people how to express their beliefs and their faith, particularly as a person who regularly wears T-shirts with pentagrams and nonsense like that, so that you have to be prepared for the fact that this is just going to be as insulting for other people, but also because I think that people are free. Even though I think that the world would be better without religion, I do believe that people should have the right to hold whatever religious views they want, provided that they are freely, that they reach them freely.
I totally agree. And I feel like, if somebody has those standards of modesty for themselves based upon their religious beliefs, that might not be something I believe. To me, it might not feel like the optimal lifestyle, but I have nothing to say about it. Maybe for them it is, maybe for some people, being in this theistic mindset, having these tenets of these old religions and putting it within the framework of their own personal lives and how they conduct themselves. I've met plenty of people who claim to be people of faith, but they also believe in pluralism. They also believe in not allowing the government to impose restrictions on even Satanist viewpoints. I have no problem with them. I have no problem with somebody who says that due to their faith, they would never get an abortion. That's fine. Then don't do it. If that's who you are, who you feel you are, and that's how you identify, and that's something you just wouldn't do, that is your choice. The real problem is when they try to order the world to those tenets that they should be holding personally and holding themselves accountable to. And I think you see a real distinct difference between the type of people who are concerned with everybody else following these tenets and the people who are concerned with their own internal spiritual life and following those kinds of tenets. And you'll find, I think, that they are completely different people with a real completely different interpretation of those beliefs, to the point that the politicians, I think, who are using Christian nationalism as a cudgel, I don't believe for a moment that they hold themselves accountable to any of these things. It was rumored.
Are you honestly saying that Donald Trump is not a religious person? Are you honestly suggesting that that man does not hold himself up to high moral standards?
Well, it was also rumored that George W. Bush had a girlfriend or something of the type that had an abortion. I'm not sure that was ever confirmed, but it wasn't a surprising idea. It might not be true, but it's the kind of thing I feel like we expect from the politician at the pulpit, that degree of hypocrisy. I think you see that hypocrisy all the time in the people who are telling everybody else that they need to live their lives by the religious tenets of that person. I think they are the least likely, as I said, to be holding themselves accountable to that type of thing.
Haggard was one of the top evangelical preachers. Big church, 14,000 members. But in 2006, a male prostitute accused Haggard of paying him for sex and using crystal meth. Now, he said this went on for 3 years. Haggard denied it at first, but finally came clean. Sort of.
We get the latest now on the scandal engulfing conservative Christian leader Jerry Falwell Jr. A former pool attendant who became Falwell's business partner is now speaking out about his affair with Falwell's wife, saying Falwell approved and observed the intimate relationship, putting Falwell's leadership of Liberty University in jeopardy.
A woman has come forward accusing the pastor of a North Texas megachurch of sexual abuse. Robert Morris is the founder and senior pastor at Gateway Church in Southlake. A woman has come forward alleging Morris sexually abused her as a child for 4 years, starting in 1982. In response to the allegations, Morris reportedly told the Christian news outlet he engaged in inappropriate sexual behavior.
Jeez, Rick, oh my God. That's some pretty hardcore stuff. What in the hell?
One of the things that are very important on this separation of church and state is that the state should never have the power or the right to decide what is something that people really believe or what is or isn't a religion. In the United States, you recently encountered that problem with, I forgot his name now, but the governor of Florida.
Ron DeSantis.
Yes, Ron DeSantis, because he passed this, or rather signed into law this measure to have chaplains, I think, in schools.
Yeah, correct.
And he was asked about what if the Satanists want to have a chaplain in school. I don't know if they were specifically referring to the Satanic Temple, but he says, well, no, obviously that doesn't apply to them because they're not a religion. You did create a campaign already to start deploying your own chaplains. You called it, I think, Thanks Ron. What exactly is happening in Florida, and why is it so important for you to have, or for members of the temple to be involved in schools?
They're trying to turn public schools into churches. You know, I already talked about putting Bibles in schools, putting Ten Commandments in schools, and now they want to put religious chaplains into schools. And the rationale for that, of course, they always lie about it. You know, they try to make it sound like there's a secular purpose for this, and they say that they're addressing the increased emotional needs of children during these troubled times, and pointing to statistics where, you know, depression rates are up, diagnoses of all types are up, suicides are probably up, that kind of thing. And of course, they have one answer, one solution to all problems, and that's we need to bring religion to the children. And the idea, though, is that chaplains provide this emotional support for the children that isn't otherwise there, and sometimes they need spiritual guidance or counseling. Now, kids can get that outside of school and are probably better off doing that in a different environment, and they already have school counselors, and this could really end up, it turns into a real issue. This was attempted to be passed in many other states, and other states shut it down, voted against it. And a lot of actual chaplains who've long-term worked as chaplains in the military and in other contexts are opposed to these bills as well, because you have a new kind of subset of fairly untrained chaplains lined up to go into schools, and they may not have any real sense of the reporting standards for emotionally troubled youth that they're supposed to be serving. They might end up in redundancy or conflict with the counselors in the schools, or they may end up, making the counselor's job redundant and, ruining another profession because they've brought in their politics into the schools again. But, if they were going to have the chaplains in the schools, we were clear that we think it's a terrible idea. But as with our after-school clubs, where we have come in as an alternative to the proselytizing Christian clubs, we said we'd offer chaplains as well. Ron DeSantis declared from a podium during a press conference that we would not be allowed to have chaplains in the schools because we're not a religion. He doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, and he's putting school districts in a precarious situation if they believe him, because what he says from a podium during a press conference has nothing to do with the text of the law he signed into law, which doesn't offer any caveats that would prevent us from going into the school districts. He's wrong by saying we're not a religion. We're already recognized as one in the United States. We're a 501(c) tax-exempt church, the Satanic Temple is. And we also had our religious status affirmed unambiguously by a federal judge in a lawsuit we had in Arizona, where the defense tried to make the claim that we really didn't have a religious discrimination case because we couldn't be considered an actual religion. Going through the evidence, the judge said, no, it's absolutely clear that they are. So we have that precedent behind us. So he's 100% entirely wrong. And also, he doesn't give a shit if he's wrong. We've come to the point now where people are playing the news cycle. They know that they're appealing to a certain lowest common denominator whose memory span is somewhere under 24 hours. They're driven by the emotions that are fueled by their irresponsible words. So even when we end up in a school district later on, it probably won't have a negative effect on Ron DeSantis, whom I've offered to debate twice, and Fox News covered it both times that I opened the door to a debate with that little fucking shit, and he didn't take it up either time because he's a scared little asshole, and he knows that he has no facts on his side. He couldn't argue the case, and that I would I would mop the floor with his dumb ass. Like, he can say it's beneath his dignity, but that little shit isn't worthy of licking Lucy's dog shit off of my shoe. He doesn't know his fucking job. To me, that's even worse than Marjorie Taylor Greene spouting conspiracy theories. It's one thing that she believes really stupid things, and you might have some tolerance for that, just in the way you have tolerance for a tenured professor's bizarre opinions in the name of academic freedom. But at the point where you don't understand the limits of your authority in a public office, the point where you don't understand how the law works and that you can't just change the Constitution by fiat, that's when you should immediately be removed. There are few jobs where you can be as fucking irresponsible and as incompetent as somebody like Ron DeSantis is as a governor, and still keep your job and even flourish at it. But in the United States now, they've made so many exemptions for the politicians who should be held to a higher standard and not a lower standard. And now we're dealing with the nightmare of the Supreme Court giving general immunity, upholding the idea of general immunity for our commander-in-chief, our presidents, to the point where it seems completely anti-democratic to me.
I mean, I agree with you on the fact that it's anti-democratic. I'm as a non-U.S. citizen, I think that I'm fairly used to the fact that the United States, the president is fully immune. I mean, you have carried out words of aggression many times without anybody having ever faced trial. There was the Abu Ghraib. Sorry, there were issues there, but for example, when the Senate made the congressional report on torture, there were absolutely nobody was prosecuted for that. So the issue of, I would say, higher authority in the United States being de facto immune is not that new.
It cannot be emphasized enough that since September 11th, the Bush administration has claimed the power to act without any constraints of law or checks from the Congress or the courts. It is a definitively authoritarian and lawless ideology that has truly expressly become the governing philosophy of George Bush and his administration. And it is not something the administration has merely embraced in theory. It has been aggressively exercising these limitless powers. During the Obama administration in 2012, the Obama Justice Department announced, even though Obama ran on a platform in 2008 of promising to criminally investigate whether crimes were committed by the Bush and Cheney administration and the CIA during the War on Terror, things like torturing innocent people, detaining and kidnapping people from the streets of Europe and sending them with no due process to Syria and to Egypt to be tortured and interrogated, spying on American citizens without the warrants required by law. Despite promising all of that, the Obama Justice Department, in fact, did everything possible to shield the Bush administration from any form of accountability.
We're still evaluating how we are going to approach the whole issue of interrogations, detentions, and so forth. And obviously, we're going to be looking at past practices. And I don't believe that anybody is above the law. On the other hand, I also have a belief that we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards. And part of my job is to make sure that, for example, at the CIA, you've got extraordinarily talented people who are working very hard to keep Americans safe. I don't want them to suddenly feel like they've got to spend all their time looking over their shoulders and.
Hey, wait a minute, Rick. What's going on? I mean, relax, Morty. Don't worry about it. Let's just see where this goes.
We did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks. We did some things that were contrary to our values. I understand why it happened. It's important for us not to feel too sanctimonious in retrospect about the tough job that those folks had.
And the final straw, the final nail in the coffin, happened in August of 2012. And there you see the article I wrote for The Guardian. Obama's Justice Department grants final immunity to Bush's CIA torturers. And this is what I wrote, quote, the Obama administration's aggressive, full-scale whitewashing of the war and terror crimes committed by Bush officials is now complete. Thursday, Attorney General Eric Holder announced the closing without charges of the only two cases under investigation relating to the U.S. torture program. One that resulted in the 2002 death of an Afghan detainee at a secret CIA prison near Kabul, and the other, the 2003 death of an Iraqi citizen while in CIA custody at Abu Ghraib. This decision, says the New York Times Friday, quote, eliminates the last possibility that any criminal charges will be brought as a result of the brutal interrogations carried out by the CIA.
When we talk about people like DeSantis, or we talk about people like Trump, and how they are able to galvanize the support of the Christian right, I do have to ask you, don't you think that you are helping them in your opposition to them? Because I think that if you have one of these demagogues talking about or using kind of coded language to suggest that there is a satanic threat, that, you know, that the Satanists are stealing kids and drinking their blood, or whatever syphilitic idea they have, don't you think that to an extent your existence confirms those fears? Obviously, you don't do any of those bad things, don't get me wrong, but that the mere fact that you appear and that you bring a Baphomet statue with two kids next to it kind of says, oh, fuck, I mean, they were telling the truth. These people actually are there.
You know, I like to think not. I know that we do these things and it energizes a certain group of people, but to be honest, they've been crying about Satanists being behind things for so long, and I think in actuality, we undermine these claims by actually being present and being able to address them. Ever since the 80s, they were talking about these underground satanic movements being a part of the homosexual agenda, or this is what the Democrats want, and that kind of thing. And you see it now. You see, you know, the Marjorie Taylor Greene characters talking about Jewish space lasers and things like that. But I'm hoping that we actually offer something beneficial in being able to show people that, no, people can look at different symbols in different ways and have a different approach to these things. And you need to be flexible to realizing that there are different subcultures, even within your own culture, that can have completely different ideas on what these things are. And it's something we need to address. And I think, hopefully, when people think that Satanism is this massive criminal conspiracy, and yet they see us putting up a benign holiday display, and they're wondering, how can they get away with this? If they're actually doing all these horrific things, how can they do anything out in the open? Maybe some of those people will bother to learn more about us and realize that they have been lied to. And I think in some ways we actually create rifts. We put a wedge between those on the right who actually are kind of constitutional purists, who really believe in the constitutional standards that they grew up with, that they know that the United States was founded upon, and the idea that their notion of conservatism is one of small government and minimal government encroachment into people's lives. Some of those people we've actually seen who, you know, they might still be like diehard otherwise on the side of, you know, the more extreme right, but they're also not hypocritical enough to not acknowledge when there's an attempted abridgment of our First Amendment rights, and that is a bad precedent. I've been on Fox News many times, and I feel further vindicated in what I do. Like when Tucker Carlson was there, I was on 3 times, and each time he had diehard loyalists in his comments saying that, you know, you're wrong in this case. You know, the Satanists beat you in this situation. He might be an odious character for all they know about me, but my my perception of free speech rights and that kind of thing are correct, and that's something that they need to tolerate. So I'm not sure that we actually I know we galvanize some people, but I think in some ways we create schisms that might not have been there before. But I think overall, as time goes on, we end up more beneficial to the argument than anything else. And I think some of the other organizations that have worked in this kind of thing are kind of catching on to that and seeing the use to it. In the last year and a half, couple of years here, we've seen a lot of organizations working with us and trying to support us more than ever before. The ACLU has been offering, pro bono support on some of our efforts. Freedom from Religion Foundation has really thrown in strong with supporting some of the, very, very narrowly defined projects that we're working on, things like that. But I think as we really come closer to a very disturbing and harrowing election, people are starting to see us as being, real frontline ranks. In thin ranks we are, against what hopefully isn't inevitable.
Outside of the fact that I really do believe that you are unelectable, is politics something that, if there was a real possibility, is that something that you would be interested in pursuing?
Well, this job, I think, has a lot of similarities to being in politics. And as you say, I feel like I'm unelectable. But that said, I think our side of the argument needs to assimilate themselves to the fact that we're not going to get anywhere unless we start engaging with politics, unless we have people getting on school boards, getting onto city councils, doing all the things that the Christian nationalists have been doing so well. And we need to stop just renouncing being a part of the system and a part of the process. We need to stop screaming for some ill-defined or completely undefined revolution that nobody's making any efforts towards seeing through. And we need to stop thinking that our hashtags are going to change the world. We need to, if a democracy is really going to work, we need to engage with it. And to a certain degree, the overtaking of our system by these interests that couldn't be more opposed to the Constitution as it was and as the United States has been, that's a failure of ours too. I mean, we really do need to get people energized about getting into politics. We need to stop looking at it as such an ignoble profession and something to be spat on and denigrated. We need to start really developing a completely new ethic of citizenship.
You tried to, and you'll have to kind of fill in some of the blanks here, but when I say you, I mean the temple tried to go against, I think it was Oklahoma, but I could be wrong, an anti-abortion law, arguing that abortion is one of the rituals of the Satanic Temple, and that you wanted to have the freedom to basically mail some of these abortive pills or morning after pills. The court ruled against you based on the fact that you couldn't identify the potential people affected by this, because due to obvious safety reasons, no person wanted to say, oh, no, I'm the Satanist that wants to do the abortive ritual. Does that mean, do you think, that the future of that... So, actually, can you give me a little bit of background on that case? And second, do you think that that decision of saying you failed to show a specific victim, due to what you do and what you stand for, kind of puts the nail in the coffin of that legal or judicial tactic?
No, it just means we have to go about it a different way. And that's the kind of bullshit you'll get from a shitty, corrupt judge who doesn't want to rule on the law. They rule on technicality to avoid the question of the law, which we feel is solidly on our side when it comes. They didn't want to rule against religious liberty to have any type of exemptions. They just looked at what they call standing. Do you have standing to bring this suit? And they said, in this case, you're going to actually have to identify what member in this state is going to get pregnant and need an abortion before we can rule on this case, which is absolutely an absurd hurdle to put before us. But it's not insurmountable. What we need is a member who gets pregnant and then is willing to go on the record, and then we're going to be able to go. But then there's a risk. There's a risk then that is somebody pregnant and they are restrained from getting an abortion while this plays out in the court. These are the kinds of things, but they're trying to make it as difficult as they can. But we do have a clinic now, a telehealth clinic in New Mexico, and we're opening another one, our second one in Virginia, and they're telehealth, so people call in and we do distribute the pills. It was in Indiana where they said we needed to establish our standing against a specific law there. But as it is, our telehealth clinic is mailing out abortifacients, and I'm sure there are forthcoming lawsuits that are going to be attached to that in the future. But to be honest, the whole disposition of United States law, I feel like, is up in the air right now, at the point where presidents have this kind of immunity to kind of make law by doing what they do, and therefore it's legal. You're dealing with a whole new territory here, and I can't really be too clear or certain as to what our future is, depending on what happens in the near future and how a future administration handles the very basic fundamental questions of religious liberty rights and all these entrenched things we thought we didn't have, we thought were settled issues are now all up in the air again.
When you say that abortion is a ritual of the Satanic Temple, do you think there is a risk of that sounding like child sacrifice?
I mean, some people say it is, but we're not actually saying that abortion itself is a ritual, but that we have an abortion ritual that members do or can go through when they're getting an abortion. And it serves a legitimate purpose beyond just creating a stronger argument for a legal exemption on religious grounds. There's a lot of effort to instill guilt in people who get abortions in the United States. And there's a certain risk of people feeling that anyways, or being traumatized by the occurrence. And what our ritual does, we feel, is it adds kind of a real-time kind of counseling element to the entire procedure, and it lets people going through it know that in our eyes there's nothing wrong with this, so long as you came to this decision of your own free will, thought it through rationally, and have decided that this is best for you. And I feel like that's an important thing either way.
And to conclude, being today the 4th of July and kind of the anniversary of the United States independence, a country that, for all of its failings, I do believe has some pretty incredible things, one of them being the First Amendment. Considering the election coming up, as a foreigner, I honestly would not know who to vote for. So what do you think is in the future for the United States? Not just what you would like it to be, which is the conversation that we have been having, but what do you think is the realistic prospect of what is going to happen in America?
I think things are going to get a whole lot worse in my lifetime, and I'm not going to live long enough to see them improve. I think it's looking like people need to go through their cycles where they need to learn why autocracy is bad before they pull their heads out of their asses and take the slow road to recovery and there's no telling how many generations that could possibly take. I mean, when Stalin first came in, the Soviet Union, his was a brutal reign. And then Khrushchev came in and things cooled down. He gave a speech kind of denouncing some of the extreme actions that Stalin had taken. And from there was something of a tapering off effect. And, Putin is a full-on autocrat again. And you never know how many generations it takes for this kind of thing to actually be rolled back, if ever, if you survive it after a certain point. But we're at a very scary precipice right now, and I've had to resign myself to the fact that there's a limited number of things I can do, and that there's a limited number of issues that I can possibly be helpful with, or that the Satanic Temple has a use being involved in. And it takes a whole lot more of a collaborative effort to fight against this common enemy that we have now. And like I said, I just don't think we have that collaboration amongst the opposition to the theocrats at this time. I think if we had any type of unity in an effort to try to stop this or even mitigate this, it would be the easiest thing for us to do. But like I said, we have entrenched bad habits that I just don't see us breaking out of when it comes to our ideas of what activism is, how protest is done, and what actual progress looks like. And I've grown. I know you might want to leave on a more positive note, but
so going back to this thing that Ayaan Hirsi Ali used as a justification to move to Christianity, this idea of the emptiness and the hopelessness that some people find in a non-theistic approach to life, and considering the very real problems that the world is facing right now, from nuclear annihilation to climate change to the possibility of new pandemics happening in the future, this time with the experience that the minute you have any sort of restriction, people start to become a bit conspiratorial. How do you inspire yourself, or how would you try to inspire other people to actually not giving up and actually giving it a shot?
Well, my tactics probably aren't the best. I would probably point out to them that it's their duty, and I find it cowardly and pathetic that at this point they're not involving themselves in this existential battle, that we have a duty to the world, to ourselves, to everything we hold dear, to fight this the best we can. And even given my pessimism, and that I think we seem to be on a trajectory for to be seriously on the losing side, I said at the beginning I was in this to the death, and that's where I am with it. I'm to the last breath. This is where I stand, and I don't give a fuck how far they go with it. I'm still standing that ground, and if it's the last ground to be taken, they'll have to take me with it. But I don't necessarily doubt that it'll come to that.
But that's the principle of non serviam, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter whether we're going to be defeated or not. It's not whether we win, it's that we make sure that we never lose.
Yeah, and that's part. I think you can really find that kind of meaning in non-theistic belief. I think if you talk to Ayaan Hirsi Ali and she was being honest, I find it hard to believe that she would say she suddenly came to believe that the second coming of Christ is imminent and he's going to come down dressed as Elvis, and there's going to be a seven-headed monster in Israel, as a harbinger of the end of the world and all that bullshit. I think she would speak to the cultural value of it and the traditions and that sense of finding a new kind of tribal place. And I think if she thought about it a little deeper, she would realize that she doesn't need to pretend that she believes in things that are intellectually insulting, to be a part of that. And I think we have that, or optimally, you know, people who get it and understand it should have that with the Satanic Temple, where the mythology means everything to us, regardless of the fact that we don't view it as an accurate description of things that happened in the terrestrial realm. You know, this speaks to a certain kind of existential narrative that is setting a framework for who we are and what we do, and that's non-negotiable. It's an intrinsic part of us now, and I think that it has all that component. It can be, you know, as it can be as I think as moving as anything theistic. It can be as inspiring as anything theistic. It you know, I think I find it a great irony that Christ was supposedly always spoke in parables, right? Told stories. The stories weren't necessarily supposed to be true, but they were supposed to teach a lesson. And that from that ends up a cult of diehard theists who take a dogmatic approach to the unwavering historic reality of all these stories that maybe were just there to convey a message.
Dawkins mentioned this to Ayaan Hirsi Ali as well, which is basically that the world and the universe doesn't owe you meaning. You know, you just happen to be here, and it doesn't matter if something is convenient. It doesn't matter if it makes you feel better. The question is whether it's true. And the reality is that there wasn't a guy 2,000 years ago who went to hell for 3 days and then came up and went to heaven, and that his mother went up in heaven in body and soul, and all of the other mythology. So believing in it or wanting to believe in it doesn't make it true. And I think that the commitment to truth and the commitment to the values that secularism has given us is the purpose that kind of you can find through secularism and non-theistic approaches.
Yeah, I think the theistic religions value answers over truth. And I think the non-theist values the mystery and the search. You know, that becomes part of what the religious expression is. And that's why I was talking about those kinds of non-polarized dialogues and being able to listen to other points of view. That kind of flexibility in belief becomes a belief of its own. It becomes a religious practice of its own, that always evaluating, that always reevaluating, the always taking in new evidence and trying to assimilate it and make sense of it, rather than shutting yourself off dogmatically and saying that you have all the answers and you will hear no more. I think that becomes the real difference between a non-theistic left-hand path religion and a dogmatic right-hand path one.
Lucien, thank you so much for the conversation. I really appreciate it, and take care of yourself.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Will our single deed create change? Maybe. Probably not.
So then you're saying it's not the battle but the war?
I'm saying whether we ever win the war is for God to decide. For man, there's only fighting.
Fight for fighting's sake? That's so fucked up, man.
No. Fighting because injustice must always be met head on. Live like that. We may not win, but we ensure we never